I am Georgia, 26 years old. My parents didn't show up for my high school graduation, not when I was hospitalized after a car accident, not when I was homeless for 6 months at 19, sleeping in my car and showering at a gym, but when I inherited $4.2 million from the grandmother they pretended to hate. They arrived at my doorstep with balloons, fake smiles, and my golden child brother in tow. And I let them in, because I had a plan. They thought I was still the desperate daughter begging for scraps. They didn't realize I'd already written the letter that would burn every bridge they thought they could walk across. Before I take you through the moment I vanished from their lives forever, ever felt invisible in your own home, I have. Hit subscribe and stay connected to powerful women's voices. Because this isn't just a story of betrayal, it's about the one thing they never saw coming. Me. Strong, unforgiving, and holding the pen to rewrite everything they thought they controlled. Let me take you back to where it started, to the life they abandoned, and the fortune they'll never touch. The knock on the door, the fake hugs, the forced smiles, that all came later, before the inheritance, before the performance, long before I left the letter that set everything in motion. But to understand why I did what I did, you have to understand who I used to be. I wasn't always the daughter with the upper hand. I was once just a kid standing in the shadows of my own family, learning that love came with a cost I could never afford. I grew up in the same house as my parents and my younger brother, but I might as well have been a tenant. My brother, Ethan, was the golden child, the gifted one, the baby, the boy. He could do no wrong. He crashed a car at 16. Boys will be boys. I won a science fair and made the local paper. That's nice, now go set the table. Every achievement I earned was brushed aside like lint on a jacket. Every mistake Ethan made was someone else's fault, usually mine. When he skipped school, I was grounded for not keeping an eye on him. When he needed money, my savings were emptied without so much as a word. I stopped trying to explain the unfairness by the time I was 14. Silence felt safer than the gaslighting. Birthdays came and went without notice. No cakes, no gifts, not even a card. Meanwhile, Ethan got weekend trips, new clothes, concert tickets. When I asked why he got special treatment, my father's voice turned ice cold. You wouldn't understand. You're not like him. And he was right. I wasn't. I didn't know how to be effortlessly adored. I only knew how to be useful. So I cleaned, I studied, I cooked. I made sure my name never caused waves, and still, I was invisible. Unwanted, just a quiet body moving through a home that never felt like mine. At 17, I was offered a full scholarship to a university out of state. I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this will make them see me. My mother's response? You're really going to leave us like this? No congratulations, no pride, just guilt. I went anyway, and when I left, I never got a single call, not even when I ended up working 2 jobs and skipping meals to pay for books. They knew. They just didn't care. The worst part wasn't their absence, it was the fact that I still missed them. Even as I built a life from scratch, even as I clawed my way out of every corner they backed me into, some small, desperate part of me still hoped they'd show up. That they'd call, that they'd apologize. They never did. Not for the silence, not for the neglect, not for choosing my brother over me every single time. So when they finally showed up years later, smiling and holding balloons after hearing about the fortune, I didn't see parents. I saw strangers, and I knew exactly what they wanted. But what they didn't know was that the girl they forgot had become a woman they should never have underestimated. By the time I was 25, I had learned to measure my worth in silence. Not applause, not affection, just the ability to keep going when no one cared if I did. I never told anyone the full story. Not friends, not coworkers, not even the therapist I could barely afford during my first breakdown, because saying it out loud felt like betrayal. Not of them, but of the version of them I still wanted to believe in. The imaginary parents who might have loved me somewhere beneath the silence. But every scar had a story, and mine were layered like sediment. Some days, I'd walk past a mirror and catch a glimpse of the quiet girl I used to be, the one who stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes while her brother played video games in the next room. I remembered the day he threw a party while my parents were out of town, how I stayed up cleaning puke off the carpet so he wouldn't get in trouble. He got a new iPhone that weekend. I got a lecture about respecting the house. There was the Christmas I worked overtime at the diner to buy everyone gifts. I bought my brother a leather wallet he'd mentioned wanting, and my parents matching mugs that said "World's Best Mom" and "World's Best Dad." I wrapped everything in the cheapest paper I could find, set it all on the table with a note. "I love you. Merry Christmas." They didn't open the gifts. My dad called it a guilt trip, and my mom said I was trying too hard to make them feel bad. I spent Christmas night crying in my car, parked 2 streets over so no one would ask why I wasn't home. The wounds weren't always obvious. Some were quiet moments that echoed louder than yelling ever could. Like when I got sick sophomore year of college and called home out of sheer desperation. My fever was 103, I could barely breathe, and I hadn't eaten in 2 days. My mother answered, listened for 30 seconds, and said, "Well, you chose to move away. You figure it out." And I did. Again and again. By the time the inheritance came, years later, unexpectedly and without ceremony, I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment with second-hand furniture and exactly $432 in my bank account. I didn't even know my grandmother had that kind of money. She'd been quiet, strange, and largely forgotten by our family. But she remembered me. In her will, she left me everything. The house, the savings, the investments. She called me the only one who ever looked me in the eye. I cried reading that line more than I cried at her funeral. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family who let me suffer didn't even attend her service, and yet the moment the news of the inheritance hit the public records, they came knocking, literally, with balloons, and my brother, as if it were some sort of twisted birthday party. They thought it was a celebration. They had no idea it was a countdown. Growing up, I used to wonder if I'd been born into the wrong family by accident. If maybe I was the glitch in their system, too quiet, too eager, too aware of the imbalance they refused to acknowledge. But eventually, I stopped wondering, because there was no accident. They didn't forget to love me, they just chose not to, because they'd already given it all away, to him, Ethan. The golden boy with the lopsided smile and permanent safety net. My brother didn't just have everything handed to him, he never even realized there were hands involved. He floated through life with the weightlessness of someone who believed things would always work out, because they always had. When he crashed his first car, our dad blamed the road conditions. When he failed 3 college classes in a row, my mom wrote letters begging the university to reconsider. When he drained their savings with a business investment that turned out to be a pyramid scheme, they mortgaged the house to bail him out. No one yelled, no one withheld love. They just shook their heads and said, "He's still figuring it out." When I asked for help, once at 19 after getting evicted from a roommate situation gone bad, my dad said, "Maybe you should have planned better." I remember sitting in my car that night with everything I owned stuffed in the back seat, watching the condensation fog the windows as I tried to cry without making any sound. I didn't want the people walking past to see me break. I didn't want to give them a reason to look at me the way my own family did, like I was inconvenient. But Ethan? He got attention, praise, protection. My parents acted like he was some fragile relic that needed to be preserved, even as he burned every bridge he walked across. And yet, no matter how many times he failed, he was never called a disappointment. That word was saved for me. I heard it after choosing a career they didn't understand. I heard it after cutting off contact for a year, an act my mother called selfish and dramatic. I heard it in the silence that followed every achievement they couldn't claim credit for. When they showed up after the inheritance, Ethan was standing between them like a trophy, clean-cut, charming, with that same smug glint in his eye he used to flash after stealing my Halloween candy and getting away with it. He didn't say hello or how have you been. He said, "Wow, Georgia, Grandma really hooked you up, huh?" Like it was a joke, like I'd scratched a lottery ticket and stumbled into wealth instead of surviving years of abandonment and being remembered by the only family member who'd ever looked past the facade. He walked in like the house already belonged to him. My parents followed, eyes scanning every corner like appraisers. They thought they were finally getting what they deserved, but I had plans they hadn't accounted for, and a letter they'd never see coming. They walked into my house like it was some sort of reunion, like the last decade hadn't happened, like they hadn't ignored every text, missed every birthday, and let me drown in silence while they poured their attention into my brother's latest meltdown. But as they stepped across my grandmother's oak floors, the same ones I'd refinished by hand after moving in, I didn't feel the urge to scream or cry. I felt detached, like I was watching strangers tour a museum. They had no idea they were standing in the middle of something I'd built from ashes. After years of scraping by, piecing together a life they never wanted to be part of, I had finally created something stable. I had my own event planning business, a small but loyal client list, and enough savings to sleep at night without my chest tightening. The house was mine now, legally and emotionally. My grandmother had made sure of that. Every brick, every light fixture, every faded photo tucked into a frame on the hallway wall was a reminder of what I had survived and what they had walked away from. They wandered around like tourists. My mom pointed out the framed newspaper article from my first big corporate event. "This is cute," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ethan opened the fridge without asking and grabbed a soda, like he'd always belonged here, like he wasn't a guest, like he hadn't once told me I was dead weight after I refused to co-sign for a car loan. My dad looked around like he was mentally calculating property value. "Grandma had good taste," he said, as if complimenting her style erased a lifetime of neglect. They didn't ask where I'd been, what I'd done, how I'd gotten here. They didn't ask how I'd gone from a broke 20-year-old sleeping in my car to the woman who now owned a 2-story house on 2 acres of land. They didn't want my story. They just wanted what they thought came easy. But nothing about my life had been easy. Every square inch of that house had been fought for, through exhaustion, heartbreak, and an ironclad refusal to become the version of myself they'd expected, broken and begging. The business, I'd built it while juggling waitressing jobs and night classes, working out of coffee shops with spotty Wi-Fi and chairs that left my back in knots. The house? I'd inherited it, sure, but no one saw the months I spent sanding, painting, fixing plumbing with YouTube videos and bruised knuckles. The money? It didn't fall into my lap. It came with responsibility, legal paperwork, estate taxes, and a heavy, aching grief for the one woman who saw my value without needing proof. So when my parents looked at me with new interest, pretending to admire what I'd done, I didn't feel proud. I felt insulted, because they weren't impressed by my survival. They were interested in what they could extract from it. But I already knew they weren't going to get a single thing. I just hadn't told them yet. When the lawyer first called, I almost didn't answer. I thought it was another scam, someone trying to convince me I owed money I never borrowed or pretending I'd won a prize that didn't exist. But the voice on the other end was calm, professional, and very real. "Miss Elliott, I'm calling regarding the estate of Margaret Ellison. You've been named as the primary beneficiary." I had to sit down, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I didn't understand. My grandmother and I weren't close in the traditional sense. We didn't do family dinners or Sunday phone calls. But there had always been a quiet bond between us, something unspoken and honest. I visited her when no one else did. I mowed her lawn, brought her groceries, sat with her in silence when words felt useless. I never did it for reward. I did it because she was the only one who looked at me like I mattered. Her house had been sitting vacant since the funeral, a weathered property tucked away on the edge of town. I thought the bank would take it. I thought my parents or Ethan would have claimed it already. But she left it to me, everything, the house, the land, the accounts, her investments, which turned out to be far more significant than anyone knew. I sat in that law office with a stack of papers in front of me and a pen in my hand, stunned. My parents hadn't been notified yet. The will was airtight, no contest clauses, no ambiguity. My name was on every line that mattered. She was clear about her wishes, the lawyer had said, sliding over a sealed envelope. "She left this for you." The letter was short, written in her shaky, looping handwriting. "I saw you, even when no one else did. This is yours. Make a life worth living, not one worth explaining." I didn't cry then. I didn't know how, not after everything. I just folded the letter, tucked it into my bag, and walked out of that office feeling like I was carrying a secret the whole world would try to take from me. For 3 weeks, I didn't tell anyone. I moved into the house quietly, started transferring utilities, updating legal documents, and setting up appointments with a financial advisor. It felt surreal. The marble countertops, the antique furniture, the accounts with more zeros than I'd ever seen in my life. It was all mine, and not because I begged or stole or manipulated. because someone who knew me, really knew me, had trusted me with something that mattered. Then the records went public. It started with a text from an old classmate I hadn't spoken to in years. "Damn, you're rich now?" I ignored it. But the next day my phone buzzed again. A call from a number I recognized all too well. My mother. I didn't answer. Then Ethan. Then my dad. And then they were on my front porch, smiling like nothing had happened, like we were a family again. But I knew better, and this time I was ready. It didn't take long. The moment the inheritance details hit public record, the silence I had spent years getting used to shattered overnight. Suddenly, I had a family again, just not the kind that shows up when you're scraping together rent or recovering from heartbreak. This was a different kind of reunion, calculated, performed, disgustingly transparent. The first voicemail was from my mother. Her voice was syrupy, false concern dripping from every syllable. "Georgia, sweetheart, we just heard about Grandma. We've been thinking about you. Can we stop by? It's been too long." No mention of the years they ignored me, no apology, just a soft pitch wrapped in sentimentality like she was trying to sell me a reunion I hadn't ordered. Then came Ethan, with his usual cocky charm. "Yo, G, heard you came into some serious luck. Let's catch up. I've got some ideas we could talk about, investment stuff." I laughed out loud when I heard that. Ethan and investments had only ever meant fast money schemes and maxed out credit cards. But now he smelled opportunity, and like always, he assumed it belonged to him. By the time they actually showed up, I wasn't surprised. I watched them through the window before I opened the door. My father in his pressed shirt, pretending not to care. My mother clutching a gift bag, probably recycled from Ethan's last birthday. And Ethan himself smirking like he was walking into his rightful inheritance. They looked so pleased with themselves, like this was a movie where they'd come back just in time to save the day. I let them wait. 5 minutes. 10. I watched as my mother adjusted her blouse, as my father paced, as Ethan pulled out his phone, probably texting someone about how the cash cow opened the door. And then I let them in. "Wow," my mother said immediately, her eyes scanning the foyer. "This place is stunning. Your grandmother had such taste, and you've done so much with it already." Her voice was too sweet, like she was trying not to choke on her own envy. "Must be weird, huh?" Ethan said, walking ahead like he owned the place. "Going from broke to loaded overnight." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Their presence said enough. They weren't here for reconciliation. They were here for the money, the house, the comfort I'd earned while they watched me suffer and did nothing. Now that the suffering had ended, they wanted to share in the rewards they hadn't earned, and somehow they believed they were entitled to it. My dad cleared his throat. "You know, your grandmother always said family should stick together. Maybe this is our chance to do that. Start fresh." I nodded slowly, hiding the bitterness I could taste at the back of my throat. "Maybe," I said. But I already knew this wasn't a beginning. It was the end. And they had no idea what was coming next. They came dressed for the part. My mother in a flowy blouse and modest pearls, like she hadn't spent the last 10 years pretending I didn't exist. My father in khakis and forced calm, trying to pass off discomfort as charm. Ethan, of course, in his signature designer hoodie, probably borrowed or bought with someone else's credit, walking like he owned the place, grinning like he knew how this story ended. But what none of them realized was that the moment I opened that door, the game had already begun. I wasn't letting them in for reconciliation. I was letting them in so I could watch the lies play out, start to finish, in my own home, on my own terms. They came bearing gifts, literally. A cheap bottle of wine, still in its store bag, and a framed photo of the 4 of us from when I was maybe 10. A rare moment where we were all in the same place, smiling through clenched teeth. My mother handed it to me like it was sacred. "We thought this would be a nice reminder," she said, "of when things were simpler." I didn't have the heart, or maybe I didn't have the energy to tell her that picture had always made me feel like the ghost in the frame. They settled into my living room like they belonged there, commenting on the decor, the flooring, the view from the back window. My dad even made a half joke about how I'd done well for myself, finally. Ethan stretched out on the couch, flipping through one of my design portfolios like it was a catalog, asking lazy questions about how much certain clients paid and whether I had connections for his newest business idea. Something about cryptocurrency and cannabis gummies. I didn't answer. Instead, I watched them, studied them, how they moved, how they looked at each other, how not once did they ask how I was. Not really. They just kept circling the inheritance like vultures waiting for the signal to descend. My mother was the first to break character. "We were just so shocked," she said softly, "that your grandmother would leave everything to you. It's just unexpected." I almost admired her restraint. She didn't say unfair, not yet. "She always liked Georgia the most," Ethan added. "Probably figured she'd be the easiest to guilt into sharing." My stomach twisted, not from his words, but from the familiarity of them. That was the dynamic they remembered, the one where I backed down, kept the peace, apologized for existing. But I wasn't that girl anymore. The visit lasted just over an hour, long enough for them to plant the seeds of entitlement, long enough for me to confirm everything I already suspected. They didn't come to reconnect. They came to collect. What they didn't know, what they never saw coming, was that while they were measuring drapes and dreaming of dollar signs, I was already writing the ending. One they wouldn't be around to see. The next time they visited, they brought baked goods, store-bought muffins dumped into a glass container to look homemade. My mother's idea of effort. She held them out to me like a peace offering, her eyes wide with faux warmth. "We thought it'd be nice to bring something," she said, "like old times." I took the container without a word, walked it straight to the kitchen, and set it on the counter next to my untouched ceramic fruit bowl. The silence was heavy, deliberate. I wanted them to feel how empty their gestures were. They weren't here for muffins. They were here to feed on whatever they thought was left. They sat on the velvet sofa, my grandmother's, the one I'd had cleaned and restored, and spoke in careful tones. Too careful. Every word sounded like it had been rehearsed in the car on the way over. My father leaned back like he was settling into his rightful seat. Ethan had his phone in one hand, but his eyes kept scanning the room like he was mentally cataloging valuables. My mother sipped from the tea I poured her, even though she hated chamomile, and complimented the curtains. "You've made the place so sophisticated." She paused. "She'd be proud." "We're proud." It was laughable, really. They were so committed to the performance they couldn't see how badly it was landing. The way my father's eyes lingered on the silverware when I brought out cups. The way Ethan accidentally opened the hallway closet and made a show of how many coats I had. My mother kept brushing invisible lint from her pants, glancing at my wrist every few minutes, probably tracking the absence of a diamond watch. They were scavengers in a mansion they didn't help build, sniffing around for weakness disguised as welcome. At one point, Ethan nudged a framed photo on the console table. It was me and Grandma, taken a few weeks before she died. We were sitting on the back porch, sunlight catching the edges of our hair, faces soft with something that felt like real peace. "Weird she didn't leave anything to anyone else," he said, loud enough to float through the room. "Feels kind of intentional." I met his gaze without blinking. She was always intentional. My voice didn't waver, but the chill in it was unmistakable. He dropped his eyes first. My mother cleared her throat and tried to pivot. "It's just been such a difficult time for us," she began. "Grieving her, and now, seeing all this. It's a lot. I think we all just want what's fair." I wanted to laugh. Fair, as if that word meant anything coming from them. They weren't grieving, they were calculating. When they finally left, my mother hugged me too long. My father offered a half-hearted pat on the shoulder. Ethan muttered, "Nice place, Georgia," like he was staking a claim. I watched them drive away from the front porch, the same place I'd once stood waiting for them to come back for me. They never had, and now they wouldn't see me coming either. After their second visit, something shifted. I stopped wondering if they might surprise me, might change, might realize the weight of what they'd done, or failed to do. That hope, however small and stubborn, finally snapped. I saw them for what they were. Tourists in my life, showing up only when the souvenirs were worth something. They didn't want reconciliation. They wanted access. and what they couldn't ask for directly, they were trying to inch toward with compliments and casseroles. I wasn't just the daughter anymore, I was the bank vault with a heartbeat. I began playing along, slowly, carefully, because if they were going to perform, I could too. I invited them to dinner. One big meal, I said, just us. A way to reconnect, I told my mother over the phone, layering sweetness over the silence I'd practiced for years. She was too eager, too relieved. That sounds wonderful, sweetheart, she said, voice sticky with victory. I could almost hear her setting the table in her mind, counting silver spoons that didn't belong to her yet. I cooked everything myself. From scratch. Roast chicken glazed with thyme and honey, garlic mashed potatoes with heavy cream, roasted carrots and parsnips caramelized until they glistened. I laid out linen napkins, polished my grandmother's silver, lit the dining room with the chandelier they once joked was too fancy for someone like you. I made it all perfect. Not for them, for the moment. They arrived dressed like it was a holiday. Ethan even wore a button-up, tucked in badly. My father brought a bottle of wine with a price tag still stuck to the bottom. My mother wore the pearls again. "This is beautiful, Georgia," she said as I guided them in. "She would have loved this." Maybe she would have, but this wasn't about her. Not anymore. We ate, we talked, or rather, they talked. About themselves, about the changes they'd made, about how family was everything. Ethan pitched a business idea halfway through dessert, some tech startup he swore just needed a little seed money to explode. My mother mentioned how hard it had been downsizing after retirement. My father said he'd been meaning to ask about the house. Who did I have helping manage the estate? Did I have support? I nodded through all of it, smiling politely, until the plates were cleared and the wine was nearly gone. And then I brought out the envelope. Thick, sealed, heavy with intention. I set it in the center of the table like a final course. My mother's fingers twitched. Ethan leaned forward. "What's this?" he asked, like he already knew. "It's a letter," I said. "One I wrote for the three of you. I figured since we're all being honest tonight, it's time I shared my side." I didn't let them open it there. I made them wait. "You'll read it when you get home," I said, standing. "But I'll give you the summary. Everything you think is about to happen, this family reunion, this fortune sharing, this fresh start, it's not. That chapter's already written, and you're not in it." They didn't speak. My mother's eyes glazed with confusion. My father's face tightened. Ethan muttered something I didn't bother to catch. "Thank you for coming," I said, and opened the door. They walked out slower this time. In the letter, which I knew they'd tear open the second they got to the car, I detailed it all, the years of abandonment, the silence, the cruelty, and now the performance. I ended it with a legal notice, a cease and desist, signed by my attorney, revoking any financial access or rights to my estate, and warning them against further attempts. I didn't need to slam a door or shout a speech. That letter was my revenge, quiet, permanent, and long overdue. After the letter, I expected silence, maybe a few days of stunned withdrawal, a hasty retreat to regroup, lick their wounds, and come back swinging with a new angle. I'd seen the cycle enough to know how it worked, but what I didn't expect was how quickly they tried to rewrite the story, as if I hadn't already beaten them to the final draft. They didn't stay away, not even for a week. 3 days after that dinner, my mother showed up alone. No call, no warning, just the echo of her knock on my front door at 8:30 a.m. I stood in the hallway, coffee in hand, watching her through the frosted glass. Her arms were crossed, mouth tight. She was done pretending to be soft. That phase had expired. When I opened the door, she didn't wait for an invitation. "We need to talk," she said, stepping inside like she still had the right. I didn't stop her. I let her in, because I wanted to see what came next. She moved through the house slower this time, like the walls had grown teeth. "That letter," she said, spinning to face me in the kitchen, "was cruel." Her voice was sharp now, not wounded, indignant. "After everything we've done for you, after everything we've lost, this is how you treat us?" I set my mug down and leaned against the counter, arms folded. "What exactly have you lost, Mom?" Her face twitched. "We lost time. We lost connection. We were trying to make things right." No, I said, my voice even. You were trying to make things profitable. She flinched like I'd slapped her, but she didn't deny it. That was always her way. Let the silence speak louder than the truth ever could. You were always so dramatic, she muttered, turning away. Even as a child. That stung more than I let show. The way she could reduce a lifetime of pain into a flaw, a character defect she could use to dismiss me again. But I didn't rise to it. I let her talk. I let her try to twist it. And when she left, after accusing me of turning my back on family, of being poisoned by resentment and pride, I thanked her for stopping by and closed the door gently behind her. Letting her in wasn't a mistake. It was a test, and she failed it the second she made the visit about her own discomfort instead of my betrayal. The next day, my father called. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail I listened to only once. You've made your point. You've punished us enough. Now grow up and move on. No apology, no accountability, just the same tired line I'd heard my entire life. You're too sensitive. Let it go. Pretend it didn't happen so we can all sleep easier. But I wasn't pretending anymore. Even Ethan reached out. A text this time. You really gonna let money break up the family? I stared at the screen for a long time before deleting it without replying. They thought I was just drawing a boundary. What they didn't realize was I had already built the wall. And while they were busy trying to chip at the edges, I was furnishing the other side, building a new life where I didn't have to justify my survival. I let them in one last time, not out of hope, but out of clarity. I needed to see for myself that they hadn't changed, that they never would. Now, I didn't need to explain why the door would stay closed. I had seen everything I needed, and more importantly, I had nothing left to prove. I didn't plan for the dinner to be the turning point. I thought it would be just another performance, me giving them the illusion of closeness, them circling like sharks, waiting for me to bleed vulnerability. But somewhere between the second course and the silence that followed dessert, something broke. Not loudly, not with a crash, just a quiet unraveling, like a seam finally giving way after years of pressure. They sat around the table, forks tapping against ceramic, voices soaked in forced sweetness. My mother complimented the wine. My father asked if I had someone helping with the money stuff. Ethan pitched another business idea, this one involving a food truck and upscale fusion. I nodded, smiled, played the role they expected. They laughed, unaware I was already writing their exit in my mind. What changed wasn't the words, it was the look. It happened when Ethan leaned across the table and said with that same smug tone he used in high school, "You know, Georgia, you could really make a difference in this family if you shared even a little of what you've got. It's not like you need all of it." My mother didn't correct him. My father didn't flinch. They all just stared, waiting for me to say yes. Like I always had. Like it was a given. And in that moment, I saw it clearly. Not just what they were asking for, but how little they thought of me. I was still the backup plan, the emergency fund, the resource. They hadn't come to make amends. They'd come to take. So I got up, I walked to the sideboard where I'd placed the envelope earlier and returned with it in my hands. Their eyes followed me like hawks. My mother reached for it first, but I pulled it back. "You'll open this when you leave," I said. "Not before, not here." "What is it?" Ethan asked, already annoyed. "A goodbye," I said quietly. They all stilled. The room pulsed with confusion, with disbelief. My father tried to laugh. "Don't be dramatic," he said, always the same line, like it would erase everything. "We're just talking." "No," I said, "you're calculating, and I'm done being the variable." The rest of the meal passed in silence. No one reached for seconds. No one asked for dessert. When they finally left, the envelope clutched in my mother's hand like it might still turn into money. I didn't watch them drive away. I just shut the door and exhaled. That night, I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine and stared out at the garden my grandmother planted years ago. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. For the first time, the house felt like mine, not just in paperwork, but in presence. I'd taken back the space, the narrative, the ending. They had their dinner, their moment, their final chance, and I had my freedom. The official will reading took place in a dim, wood-paneled office that smelled faintly of dust and forgotten secrets, the kind of place where legacies are confirmed and broken in the same breath. I sat on one side of the heavy mahogany desk, the executor, a small, soft-spoken man named Harold, on the other. Across from me sat my parents and Ethan, squeezed into chairs too delicate for their egos. My mother wore black as if this were a funeral, though she hadn't attended the real one. My father was visibly irritated, checking his watch every few minutes, tapping one foot like the floor owed him answers. Ethan wore sunglasses indoors, probably to hide the hangover he didn't expect to have to fake mourn through. I'd arrived early, calm, dressed in a tailored black blazer and slacks, not to impress them, but to remind myself I didn't need to shrink anymore. The sun poured through tall windows, catching the gold band on my grandmother's ring, the one I now wore on my right hand. It glinted every time I shifted in my seat, and I noticed my mother watching it, her expression pinched. Harold began to read. His voice was measured, clinical, unshaken by the tension crawling across the room like smoke. He started with the formalities, the date, the legal wording, the clause that confirmed the will was final and incontestable. I knew it by heart. I'd read it already, more than once, alone in my living room with a pen in one hand and disbelief in the other. But hearing it spoken out loud, with them sitting just feet away, was something else entirely. To my granddaughter, Georgia Elliott, Harold read, I leave the entirety of my estate. This includes the residence at 48 Willows Lane, all financial holdings, investments, personal property, and assets accumulated over the course of my lifetime. It is my full intention that no other party receive or assume ownership of these assets, as this gift is given in recognition of her care, loyalty, and integrity. The silence that followed was absolute. My father blinked first. My mother inhaled sharply, her lips pressed tight like she was physically swallowing her rage. Ethan sat up straighter. That's it? He asked, his voice cracking just slightly. Harold looked up. Yes, that's the will. That can't be right, my mother said, shaking her head. There has to be an addendum, something else. She wouldn't just leave everything to Georgia. She did, I said, finally speaking. My voice was calm, even, but it cut through the room like ice. Because she saw you. All of you, and she made her choice. Ethan stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward with a screech that startled even Harold. She was old, he snapped, probably confused. This is insane. No, I replied, standing too. What's insane is thinking you could show up after ignoring her and me for years and still expect a payout. My mother was crying now, but it wasn't grief. It was the grief of lost opportunity, of doors she assumed would always open for her. My father said nothing, but the red creeping up his neck spoke volumes. He was embarrassed, not for what they'd done, but for being outplayed. I turned to Harold. Are we done here? He nodded. You're free to go. And I did. I walked out of that office into the bright midday sun, the weight of generations lifting off my shoulders. Behind me, I heard my mother call my name, once, soft, uncertain. I didn't turn around. Some doors, once closed, stay that way. And some inheritances are more than money. They're a message. She chose me. And I finally chose myself. The letter had been written days before the will reading, long before the staged muffins, before the fake apologies, and the eager smiles. I wrote it late one night at my grandmother's old desk, the one tucked into the corner of her sunroom, where the air still smelled faintly of lavender and lemon oil. I sat in her creaky chair, wrapped in a thick cardigan that still carried her scent, and wrote with a black fountain pen that bled slightly into the paper. I didn't edit, I didn't second guess. I let the words come like they'd been waiting in my chest for years. I didn't write it to soothe them or explain myself. I wasn't interested in closure if it meant softening the truth. I wrote it so there would be no misunderstanding, no room for twisting the narrative later. It was addressed to all three of them, my mother, my father, and Ethan, but it was meant for the version of them that still believed they could rewrite history just because I had something they wanted. I left the letter inside the house after the will reading. I waited until they were gone, then drove to their apartment. Yes, I still knew where they lived, and slid it under their door. A white envelope sealed with a wax stamp from my grandmother's writing set. I didn't need to see their faces when they found it. I could already picture the confusion, the scrambling to open it, the disbelief washing over them in waves. It began with the words they never expected. This is not an apology. It's a declaration. I told them everything. Not just about the betrayal I'd lived through, but about the damage it caused. I wrote about the birthdays they forgot, the meals skipped, the years they made me feel like a burden. I detailed the nights I cried myself to sleep in college because my emergency fund went to Ethan's accident and they told me to be understanding. I reminded them of the time my car broke down on the side of the highway and they didn't answer my calls, not once, because they were on vacation. I listed the loans I gave them, every cent, the receipts I'd saved, the promises they never kept. I wrote about how they had trained me to believe that love meant sacrifice and that the more I gave, the more they'd maybe, one day, give back. But they never did, and they never would. And then I told them the part they never saw coming, that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was done. The kind of done that doesn't leave room for reunion dinners or healing talks over coffee. I didn't want revenge. I wanted distance. I didn't want them to suffer. I just wanted them to stop standing on the edge of my peace, waiting for a crack. At the end of the letter, I wrote one last line in bold, steady handwriting. There is no seat for you at this table anymore. Please stop knocking. I signed my name, not Love Georgia or your daughter, just my full name, Georgia Elliott, a name they had dismissed for years, a name they'd now remember for all the wrong reasons. Then I stood outside their door for a moment, listening to the stillness behind it. I thought I might feel sad, maybe even guilty, but instead I felt something else, freedom. The letter was quiet revenge. A truth they couldn't unhear, a boundary they couldn't charm their way around. But what came next was louder, messier, and entirely by design. It wasn't enough for them to read the words. I needed them to live with them, to understand that actions have consequences, even for people who've spent their whole lives dodging them. I filed paperwork the morning after I left the letter. My attorney had it ready for weeks, a cease and desist order barring them from contacting me in any form, calls, texts, emails, social media, legal documentation they couldn't ignore, especially when served by a process server who showed up at their front door with a camera and clipboard. It wasn't about humiliation, it was about clarity. This was no longer an emotional fallout. It was a legal wall, and I wanted them to feel how solid it was. The next move came quietly but hit hard. I revoked every co-signature, every shared responsibility I'd stupidly agreed to over the years. My name was pulled from the truck loan Ethan still hadn't paid down. I closed the joint account my mother had once used just for emergencies, but drained twice for shopping sprees. I shut down every digital tie, changed every password, locked down my credit with all 3 bureaus. They didn't just lose access, they lost leverage. My father's call came first, blocked by the court order, but he still left a voicemail. His voice wasn't angry, it was stunned, hollow. "You went too far," he said, like I'd pulled a fire alarm in a room that wasn't already burning. Then Ethan, "You just ruined my credit, Georgia. What the hell is wrong with you?" Like I hadn't warned him 100 times, like he hadn't ruined mine first. My mother, of course, made it personal. "This is not who we raised. You're cold now, cruel." But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't becoming cruel. I was becoming immune to their manipulation, their rewrites, their endless expectations. The final reveal came 2 weeks later when I made a quiet announcement on social media. Just a single post, a photo of the front door of my house with a brass nameplate installed beneath the knocker. Georgia Elliott and Cumberland Events, private residence and headquarters. No caption, no explanation, but people understood. And the ones who didn't weren't my audience anymore. They saw it. I know they did. Ethan's girlfriend tried to like the post, then unliked it a minute later. My cousin shared it with the comment, "Wow, look at her go," and my mother blocked me entirely. That was my revenge. Not yelling, not begging, not even punishing, just cutting the cord, walking away, and building something beautiful where they couldn't reach. Let them talk. Let them spin their stories to anyone who'll still listen, because I wasn't listening anymore, and they were no longer part of the narrative. Ethan cracked first. I expected it, really. He'd always been the one least equipped for rejection, for consequences, for life without someone cleaning up behind him. The day after the nameplate photo went live, he showed up at my office address unannounced, not realizing I'd already moved everything to remote. My assistant, someone who knew just enough of the story to be protective, called me from the parking lot, her voice tight. There's a man here saying he's your brother. He's loud. I didn't answer the phone when he called next, or the one after that, but I did get the string of texts, pages of blame, accusations that I had destroyed his future, that I humiliated the family, that I'd turned into one of those bitter rich girls. He even dragged our grandmother's name into it, calling her senile for leaving everything to me, as if rewriting her memory could somehow justify his entitlement. I didn't respond. He escalated. "You owe me," he wrote. "I carried this family when no one else did." That line nearly made me laugh. By the time I blocked his number, he was spiraling, posting cryptic things online, vague threats, self-pity dressed as wisdom. I watched from a distance, not because I cared what he thought, but because I needed to see the truth laid bare. Without access to my money, without the illusion of control, Ethan wasn't golden anymore. He was just lost, and loud about it. When Ethan realized I wasn't coming back, he didn't retreat, he redirected. The blame that had always been pointed at me began to twist, shift, and settle exactly where it belonged, on our parents. I didn't hear about it from them, of course. They had gone silent, licking their wounds in private. But the noise found its way to me through the cracks. A forwarded email from a distant cousin, a screenshot from a friend who still followed Ethan on social media. The golden boy had lost his shine, and now he was pointing fingers. In one post, he said he'd never been taught how to handle money because certain people never modeled it. In another, he all but accused my parents of manipulation, saying they'd used him as a pawn in their guilt games. I knew the tone well. It was the sound of someone scrambling to reclaim power after realizing he never had any. My mother, predictably, tried to control the damage. I heard she was calling family members, insisting Ethan was just going through something, that I'd twisted his mind. But the damage was done. The loyalty she counted on wasn't guaranteed anymore. People were starting to ask questions. My father, from what I gathered, said nothing, just disappeared into the background like always, letting others clean up the mess while he pretended none of it was his. But this time there was no one left to clean. The silence from their side was different now. Not strategic, not waiting, just empty. They had come as a unit, smiling, united in greed. But now, stripped of access and illusion, they were nothing more than three people clinging to their own versions of the truth. And even those were starting to fall apart. While they unraveled, I built. Not out of spite, not even out of pride, just out of necessity. I had spent so many years surviving, so much energy on staying afloat, that for the first time in my life I could finally ask, what does thriving look like? The answer didn't come in designer clothes or reckless spending. It came in structure, in discipline, in putting my inheritance to work, not for appearances, but for freedom. The first thing I did was pay off every cent of student loan debt I still carried. $18,740 gone in a single wire transfer. I cried after that one, not because I couldn't afford it, but because I remembered the years I skipped meals to meet minimum payments. Next, I invested. I worked with a financial advisor, someone who treated me like a client, not a child, and we built a portfolio that matched my goals. Real estate, mutual funds, a modest but strategic chunk in tech stocks. Within 6 months, the investments had already grown by 6.4%. I wasn't just spending the money, I was multiplying it. I allocated $250,000 to create a business development fund for Elliott & Co. events. I expanded into 2 new markets, Charleston and Austin, and hired 6 new employees, all women, all paid above industry standard. We doubled our corporate accounts in less than a year. Revenue went from $460,000 to $1.1 million. For the first time, I had a wait list for clients. For the first time, people came to me. I also started something personal, quietly, without press or fanfare, a scholarship in my grandmother's name, the Margaret Ellison Grant for Unseen Girls, $20,000 a year, renewable for 4 years. The first recipient was a high school senior from my old neighborhood. Her application essay began with, "No one ever asks if I'm okay." I read it 3 times before calling my advisor and saying, "Make this last forever." That's the kind of wealth I wanted to build, not just for me, but for the ones like me who never had a net to catch them. I still lived in the house, though I made a few changes, renovated the kitchen, installed solar panels, built a greenhouse in the back, something my grandmother had always wanted but couldn't afford. I planted basil and tomatoes in the spring and watched them grow from the same porch where I once sat wondering if anyone would ever show up for me. The thing about revenge is that it doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it's a ledger balanced, a silence kept, a life finally lived on your own terms. They had taken so much from me, but now all they could do was watch from the outside as I built something they couldn't touch. Success wasn't the finish line, it was the boundary, and I had drawn it in permanent ink. Then, one Thursday morning, ordinary in every way except for the envelope waiting in my mailbox, thick, official. My parents' return address in the corner, their handwriting oddly formal. I stood in the doorway for a full minute before I opened it. Inside, a letter, typed, signed by both of them, apologizing, not sincerely, not completely, but in the only way they knew how, through desperation, wrapped in regret. They said they were sorry for how things played out, that they never meant to hurt me, that family makes mistakes, and that they hoped we could talk. At the bottom, a single line added in my mother's familiar scrawl. "We miss you. We need you." I folded the letter neatly and placed it on the table beside my untouched coffee. I didn't need to read it again. I already knew what it was. A signal. Not of growth, but surrender. That was the moment the power dynamic shifted completely. They weren't demanding anymore. They were asking, pleading, and for once, I was the one with the choice. I could feel it in my chest, not vindication, but calm. The kind that comes when you finally understand the war is over because you stopped showing up to fight. I didn't write back. Instead, I sent my response through action. I had my attorney issue a formal reply. Any further contact must go through legal channels, no exceptions. It wasn't dramatic, it was measured, final, a clean signature on the end of a long, painful chapter. It wasn't about punishment, it was about clarity. They no longer had access, not to my time, not to my money, not to me. 2 days later, I got a call from my cousin. My parents had begun reaching out to extended family, spinning stories, painting themselves as victims of my success, casualties of my coldness. But no one was biting anymore. The tide had turned. The sympathy that once followed them so easily now slid sideways. People had seen the letter. They'd seen the growth. They'd seen me. I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. I was the woman who built something out of silence and ashes, the woman who set boundaries and kept them, the woman who walked away and never looked back. For years, they held all the power. They wrote the rules. They controlled the story. But now, I was the one holding the pen, and I was done writing them in. 1 year later, I stood on the porch of my home, the same one they once walked into with greedy eyes and plastic smiles, and watched the sun rise over the greenhouse I built with my own hands. My hands, not theirs, not borrowed, not guilted into building something for someone else. Mine. I haven't heard from them in months. The letters stopped, the voicemails stopped, the spinning of stories to relatives who no longer wanted to hear them. That stopped too. The silence used to terrify me. Now it's peace, no drama, no manipulation, no crisis waiting in the wings, just morning light, warm coffee, and a quiet life built on boundaries. People often ask if I regret cutting them off, if I miss them, if I'd ever open the door again. And the truth is, I miss the idea of them. Not the people they were, but the parents I used to imagine they could be. But I don't live in fantasy anymore. I live in truth, in safety, in freedom. And that freedom came the moment I realized that I didn't owe anyone access to the life I bled to build. They let me suffer. Then they came back for the fortune, but I left a letter, and I walked away with everything they never thought I'd find: peace, purpose, and the power to say no. And the best part? Local news picked up my story. If you've ever had to make a painful decision to protect yourself, to choose distance over dysfunction, I want you to know this: you are not cruel. You are not broken. You are not too much. You are healing. You are reclaiming. You are rising. We're grateful you stayed with us. For more stories of women reclaiming their voice, click on the left and subscribe to stay connected. May this be a reminder, your story has power too. And remember, family is not who shares your name, it's who protects your peace.